Up at Leonora, this chap used to work on the surface, and they called him Peg Leg because he stood on a detonator and it blew his foot off. And he eventually finished up with a wooden leg. One day he collected his pay and went home, put his pay on the table and went and fed his fowls. And when he came back inside, the money was gone. So for a while he couldn't work out what woke up to it. He had a pet goat, and it walked inside just as he went out. And he says, oh, the goat must have eaten it. So he got the goat and cut its throat, cut it open, and there was his pay inside the goat's stomach. Anyhow, he straightened it all out and he went to the bank and he got his money back.
Retired miner Renzo Mazza with a slightly tall tale from the eastern goldfields of Western Australia. Bill Bunbury here with Dollypot Pick and Shovel, an account of the earliest days of Coolgardie, Kalgoorlie and other towns long gone, like Kanauna, ghost towns that mushroomed, boomed and faded back into the bush after their gold ran out. But perhaps the most remarkable point about the goldfields of Western Australia is that 100 years ago they didn't exist. Suddenly, in 1892, there was a new name on the map of Australia.
Coolgardie, in my opinion, is the most historic gold town in Australia. It was the most sensational gold discovery probably in the world as an initial discovery. And just to quote what is factual and not hearsay, when Bailey went back from this area here, and this was wilderness, there was no habitation between Southern Cross and the South Australian settlement, there was no habitation down to the coastal strip, and there was no habitation through to the Kimberleys. When Bailey went back from here to register his claim at Southern Cross, he took more than 500 ounces of gold with him, in alluvial form, that's gold free of any host rock, and in specimen form. And a fortnight later, and it's recorded, he took another 500 and odd ounces back. And not satisfied with that, about a month or so after he'd made the discovery, he took 600 ounces of gold back. That was what drew the big crowd of people to Coolgardie when that news was flashed across the world, or Australia and the world, from Southern Cross. That's what the attraction was.
You have to see the Eastern Goldfields as the end of that continuing movement of the goldfields across round from Victoria through Queensland, across the Northern Territory, through the Kimberleys, the Murchison, the Ashburton, to Southern Cross.
Historian Lenore Lehman.
And so the men are moving on continually, and if they had money, they got coaches or they rode horses, and if they were down on their luck or they were just starting, they wheeled their wheelbarrows.
And Dad came over here in 1898 and onto the goldfields shortly after he came to Western Australia. I think he was sickened of land conditions in the eastern states and wanted to do something different. And he came to Western Australia and, well, to the goldfields, because that's where everybody was coming to try and win a fortune, which they didn't do, or to make a living.
Father was the doctor there. Typhoid was very prevalent and he helped. He used his medical skills. But he did work in tents. It was a lot of tents. And, of course, it was very difficult. I mean, hundreds of them just had to die with typhoid. There wasn't the hospitalisation. Well, of course, it was very difficult because they didn't have the fresh fruits and vegetables of today. But that would be a great handicap to anybody that was sick at all. And the typhoid people, of course, would suffer greatly with food that was not fresh. I just don't know how they existed at all without the way of keeping food. You see, they weren't growing any food at that point.
Well, you just made do with whatever you could find or whatever you had. The prospectors of those days, it was a dolly pot and a pick and a shovel and a great quantity of hard work.
The granite rocks around here used to collect rainwater, and hollows in the rock would retain the water in Namma hole type of formation or just plain depressions. And some of the runoff from the rock would form soaks at the bottom of the rock. And if they picked their time of the year or following rains, they could travel quite extensively. Well, when they started stopping in places for longer periods, that didn't work too well, and as the numbers built up, they then had to devise condensing equipment to condense the salt water in the lakes. It's rather a costly way of doing it.
There's also reports of outbreaks of typhus from men drinking stagnant water in various watering holes around Kalgoorlie and other places at different times.
Some were better survivors than others, but some would take out wheat and spread it on a wet bag, keep the bag wet, and eat a handful of germinating wheat a day with potatoes and whatever else they had with them. They'd keep going. I've known that wouldn't leave it. You see, there's a great drive. Gold is a terrific magnet.
But despite the hardships and the dangers, the lure of gold drew ever larger numbers of men to the goldfields and to Western Australia. By 1900, the population of the state had trebled, thanks to gold. In the beginning, the diggings were single men's camps, canvas tents and rough humpies. But within the next few years, women too were to share the hopes and the hardships of the digger's life.
My mother's sisters and brothers all came over here. I heard so much about the mines here, about the gold, and like so many others, they followed.
By 1901, there were large numbers of women on the goldfields. For example, a third of Kalgoorlie's population in 1901 were women, two-thirds still male, so it's a young single male population, basically. But there are a considerable number of women. Some of them came to join their husbands. Many of them came to look for jobs in the newly opened hotels and public services and so on that were available.
My grandmother, she came over here in 1897 following her husband, and it was extremely hard for her. It was hard for all women. I mean, the lack of water here, we didn't get our pipeline until 1903, so everything had to be condensed or caught in the rainwater, so it was always the problem all the time. And she had a very unfortunate experience because her husband was killed just as she was coming over from Adelaide. But she had a sister here who helped her. But I believe she lived in a Hessian-built place out at Cam Valley, where the loop line train goes now. They said there was no window, just a slit in the wall and a stick proper to open. And life was extremely hard for her, particularly because there was no breadwinner. And she had 6 children with only one capable of earning. All she could do to keep her family going, because of no pensions then, was to take in washing and ironing, and because that meant hand scrubbing with the tubs and copper, and really very hard work.
Water was the trouble. There was one Christmas there, I'll never forget this Christmas. This might appear funny too, because we couldn't even get any water. You see, the water was coming from the mine, it's condensed water, and there was a rush on it. And we had to buy our Christmas dinner, which we kids didn't mind. It was a bit of a novelty, you see. But Mum always kept a goat, you see. We always had milk, goat. Mum always kept a goat. And she had to buy lemonade and give the goat a drink. I'll never forget that, because I thought it was a terrible thing to go give a goat lemonade when I could have drank the lemonade, you see. And I can see that goat, with the sniffles of the lemonade around its nose as the poor thing was having a drink of lemonade that Mum had to buy. We had to buy the water, you had to pay 2 and 6 for a kerosene tin of water. We had to be very scarce with it, and we had to have fewer baths, or more of us had to bath in the same water, which we didn't like, We used to quarrel over it would be first, it would be second, it would be third and fourth. Great big bathtub, as kids, of course.
Well, I remember the times before they got pipe water. I lived opposite the Oco Yards in Kalgoorlie, and my father used to come home at night time. He had a yoke and a couple of buckets, and he used to go across to the government standpipe and draw the water for the day.
Water eventually flowed to the fields in 1903, thanks to a talented engineer, C.Y. O'Connor. Confounding the comments of his critics, O'Connor ran a pipeline 350 miles from the coast to inland Kalgoorlie. Industry and the public both benefited, but for ordinary people it meant a transformation of their way of life.
Oh, it was marvellous, gardens sprang up overnight and all over Goldfields, with the water from the gold from down here.
But even before the coming of the pipeline, Coolgardie and its new rival Kalgoorlie had mushroomed rapidly out of the stark red soil. By 1900, the diggers' camps had become big towns.
I can recollect the camel teams in Kalgoorlie, in the main street, bringing the produce from probably down from Southern Cross and further away, and transporting through Kalgoorlie up to the northern goldfields. They were the camels. There were donkey teams also, and of course they used to pull big wagons. That was the means of transport. Of course, individually, of course, there's no motor cars when I first remember. I first remember the first motor car, I suppose, was about 1908 or 10 when one of the news agents bought a motor car, and that was the first one I saw in Kalgoorlie. As far as we ourselves were concerned, if you owned a bicycle, well, you're up in the upper bracket then.
Well, Kalgoorlie would have been already established and thriving, but this brash Kalgoorlie was starting to take over. There was a lot of jealousy between the two towns, you see, because Kalgoorlie was the old camp and it had pride of place, but then the Golden Mile was starting to be worked. But about 1901, there was tremendous building activity here. In 1897, the Palace Hotel was built, and that was something really very, very special. And Mr. Rosenthal, he was the first manager. He said he was going to make it the best in the West. And they scoured Europe for beautiful furnishings. So that was 1897.
Take Hannon Street and Boulder Road. There was a double tram service running both ways. The whole district was served by this tram service, and they were running every few minutes, the trams were. And the means of getting around, of course, that was the horse and cart day. Always horses and lorries and that, all horse-drawn vehicles everywhere, and any amount of dust, because there wasn't such a thing as bitumen then.
As Kalgoorlie came alive, Coolgardie, or the old camp, began to die. When prospectors first came in search of gold, they found it on the surface, alluvial gold. But now it was getting harder to find, except by digging deeper. And in Kalgoorlie, they had discovered the mile that Midas touched, the longest underground reef in the world. It was the beginning of big company mining and the end of an era for the self-employed miner.
The prospectors just couldn't find gold. They did their best, and they had to leave, and once a prospector left, it was a ghost town.
And many men decide to stay on in Kalgoorlie working for wages.
Historian Edwin Jaggard.
But at the same time, I often think that those who opened up the Indian Ocean Gold Trail and came down from the Murchison and Halls Creek and other places became fairly disgruntled, and I guess many of them were the men who headed off to the Klondike and various other places, because the future for them was in discovering alluvial gold and making wealth fairly quickly, rather than simply staying in a godforsaken spot and working for a long time for wages.
The post-war years were trying years. The war left its mark on the goldfields. The mining, of course, deteriorated during the war because of the men being away, and there was a slightly depressed feeling amongst the population. Life in those days of the goldfields wasn't easy. All that the young people had to look forward to was going underground to follow their father's footsteps. The wages were very low, and it was estimated in those days that the life of a miner was about 10 years.
My mother, she never said a word. I never heard her say one word of that she was planning to leave the goldfields, because she was determined that her boys were not going down those mines, because nearly every day the whistle went, somebody got killed in the mines. The mines were dangerous. So my mother didn't want her sons down those mines. And besides, see, there's to get the TV. There was no protection against that either.
Those days, I believe you couldn't see each other for the dust. And they used to bore into quartz. If you bored into quartz, well, you swallowed a certain amount of quartz with the air you breathed in and played havoc with your lungs. That's why there was so many people died of the miners' complaint.
For 3 months that I've been going on a mine looking for a job, watching those men coming in from the lift or skip, you couldn't see nothing on them except the eyes and teeth, all the rest of it covered with the dust, just like if you splash the cement all over the clothes and all that. And when they cough, you can hear them a long way, and when they bringing the spit, that's the I know, it was terrible, just like if you get it mixed cement from the lungs, and very few of them that they left full life, that they all die young. They had to work in there because there is no other job, and they had a family to keep, and those children that they was here, they try to give them a better life than they had, and if they leave that job, there's nowhere else to go.
Which is underground, instead of fusking on the surface. One compensation was the prospect of picking up a bit of sly gold. Not every miner tried it, but those who did could make life very difficult for the police squads set up to catch them.
I'm not going to tell you the man's actual name, but if I say his name was Hannigan, I'm getting darn close. His wife's name was Mary. He'd come home from work. He was fully clad in his miner's gear. There wasn't all the present-day facilities of showering and so forth, so you came home the way you came out of the ground. In this case, he had his heavy blucher boots on, and he'd sat down at the table in his working clothes, and the gold police came in. They knew that he had been up to something. They searched everywhere. They even had a look in the stew pot. And as they were hunting around, he continued to eat his dinner. Then he'd said to them, because he was of a fairly cheeky nature, he said, "Hey, Joe, pull these boots off, will you, mate, before you go?" Joe was very, very, very annoyed at this and told him where he should go, etc. "All right, you lazy bastard," said Hannigan. "I'll get him off myself." They left. And Mary, she really went for Hannigan. She said, "Now, why try to annoy them like that? They don't like you anyway." He said there was no way in this world they were going to pull my boots off. He said, "And where the bloody hell do you think I've got that bit of gold?"
That was just a common thing then, though. So many of them made their fortune through taking the gold from the mine. Some of them would plant it and go back later on at night for it. I remember one man that made a lot of money here. He hid it in his mouth. But there's many miners left here and wealthy men and went elsewhere. That was how they made their money then.
And sly gold was sometimes the only way to supplement a miner's wages, especially in the harsh conditions of the 1930s. Gold retained its value, but the competition for the jobs was fierce.
They're jumping the trains, and one thing you know, they're getting a ride here, and they're hitchhiking and getting to the goldfields, where there was a certain amount of employment on the Golden Mile. The big mines were still going actively, and that was a source of employment, and men came from all over, well, I suppose, Australia to the mines in Kalgoorlie.
During the Depression years, things were bad. There'd be upwards of 100 men standing around the shaft head waiting to see if they could get one shift underground, if somebody didn't turn up was sick. And the shift boss of those days that was in charge of the shift, he'd come out and look over the crowd and he'd pick the biggest bloke right at the back. He'd say, "Right, you come over here and all you other buggers, you go home."
And there was always the lucky find. Chris Wood recalls the day the Larkhams, father and son, found the Golden Eagle, the biggest nugget ever found in Australia, on January the 15th, 1931.
The shop was full of men and it wasn't too long before it emptied out, so I said, "Well, you better race around and have a look at that pat and see what's on." He come running back to me. It was only 200 or 300 yards away from the shop, and he come running back to me and said, "Oh, go and see it. It's bigger than a frying pan." This was one of our sayings, of course, that, they'll be unearthing something bigger than a frying pan. "Righto," he said, "you go and see it." So, of course, I went down and was lying on the ground where he'd picked it out, and old Jim was reading a letter, and the letter was still in his hand, if I remember rightly. And young Jim was on the side, and I went over and spoke to him. I said, "Do you mind if I try the weight?" And he said, "No, go ahead." I picked it up and tried the weight, and then, of course, when I put it down, that was a bit of a signal for most of the men that were all standing around for them to try the weight, and they all formed a circle and they all walked around. There was a little discussion while I was there about what it would be named. "What are you going to call it, Jim?" "Jim." "Why, gee, it looks like a lion there." "No, it's going to be Little Jim." "Now you turn around the other way and it looks like a camel." No, it's going to be little Jim. And after a little while, it got turned up the other way. Somebody turned it over and was trying it for weight. And they turned it over, and little old bloke with a goatee beard like an Uncle Sam beard, he said, "Oh, Jim, look at that. That looks like an eagle. You sell it to the American government, and they'll pay you anything for it." No, it's going to be little Jim. Never mind about what you fellas say. Anyhow, how would you sell it to the... Scadden wouldn't let you. Scadden was the Minister for Mines. He wouldn't let you. It's got to be sold here. That was the regulations and that in those times. No, little Jim it's going to be. OK, they let it go at that, and of course I went away. Then the barber used to come down from Kalgoorlie, and he used to do a bit of dry blowing and cut a few here and go back again on weekends and one thing and another. Anyhow, he had a little bit of a par in the paper saying that he was responsible for naming it the Golden Eagle. He enticed Jim to call it that. Anyhow, it's appropriate because it does look like a golden eagle.
Chris Wood and the Golden Eagle Nugget, January the 15th, 1931, the day every prospector dreams of. But it's still the place itself, as much as the gold, that even today keeps people coming and staying.
There is something about the Goldfields that you seem to always want to go back again.
Gold is the only thing that I know very much about, so I've remained on the fields.
It fascinated me, and it still does. I'll be buried in the red soil up here.
That was with Dollypot Pick and Shovel, personal recollections of life in the eastern goldfields of Western Australia. You heard the voices of Rex Mitchell, Lou Daly-Smith, Cecile Shelley, Dorothy Malloy, Marinko Lalich, Mavis Hodgetts, Doris Bartlett, Charles Dawes, Marinki Levis, Harry Ware, Charles Barton-Jones, Elizabeth and Sheila Laver, Keith Quatermain, Alice Flood, Renzo Mazza, Bernard Dowd, Tom Dunn, John Miller, Joe Zekulich and Chris Wood. My special thanks to Kalgoorlie historian Norma King and to Edwin Jaggard and Lenore Lehman for their assistance. Special effects Pat Hopper, technical production Warwick Hopping, Comrie Bucknell and Edo Brands. I'm Bill Bunbury.